My name is Lucy Collins. I'm 27, and I always thought love was built on trust. For 3 years, I believed Richard Wilson, my boyfriend, was everything I wanted: charming, funny, attentive. At least that's what I told myself every time I brushed aside the little things that didn't add up. His disappearing for hours, the occasional defensiveness over harmless questions, or that extra phone screen he always hid from me. I thought it was normal. I thought I was just being insecure. That evening started like any other. I was scrolling through Instagram, absent-mindedly liking posts while Richard busied himself on the couch with his headphones, lost in some game. My phone buzzed. A notification from a friend, Lauren. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Lucy, you need to see this," Lauren's text read. I clicked the link and my stomach dropped. There he was, Richard, smiling at a woman I didn't recognize, his arm around her like we had never existed. My heart thumped as I tapped through the comments, the messages, the tags. He wasn't just fooling around. He had multiple profiles on dating apps, searching for women who could fund his lavish lifestyle. He'd been pretending to be a marketing executive, traveling for business meetings, living this fake, glamorous life. But the truth? He worked part-time at a shoe store. Part-time. Minimum wage. And he had been living off me, my money, my patience, and, I later learned, his father, who paid his rent to keep him afloat. I remember staring at my ceiling that night, mind spinning. 3 years. And this entire time, I thought we were building a life together. The next morning, I decided I couldn't sit in silence. I grabbed my phone, fingers shaking, and began piecing together his lies. Screenshots, messages, profile after profile, Bumble, Hinge, a sugar daddy site I hadn't even known existed. Each bio was more audacious than the last. Looking for a woman who can handle a high-maintenance man. Must own a boat, vacation home, six-figure income minimum. And then the photos. Richard posing in what he claimed was his Miami business trip outfit, champagne in hand, designer watch glinting, all of it fake. I could almost hear his smirk behind each pixel, imagining he could keep fooling me forever. I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't just betrayal. It was deception layered on top of entitlement. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to break every single fragile illusion I had been nurturing about him. I waited until he came home that evening. The apartment smelled like takeout from the Chinese place he knew I hated, and I realized I was calmer than I should have been. Icy, deliberate. He noticed the glare the second he walked in. "Lucy, what's wrong?" he asked, frowning. "Wrong?" I repeated, my voice measured. "Richard, I think you know exactly what's wrong." I held up my phone, every screen a damning testament to his lies. "Explain this. Explain all of it." His eyes flickered, a nervous twitch. "Lucy, I can—" "No, save it," I cut him off. "Don't lie to me. Don't try to gaslight me. I've got screenshots, profiles, everything. Every message, every post, every lie about your job, your trips, everything." He laughed nervously. "It's not what it looks like." I slammed the phone on the counter. The sound echoed, a drumbeat of fury. "Not what it looks like? Richard, we've lived together for 3 years. I've supported you, paid for things, driven you everywhere, and you've been scamming me this whole time? Pretending to be someone you're not while living off me and your father?" His face went pale, a deer caught in headlights. I didn't mean—" "I don't care what you meant," I snapped. "I care about what you did, and it's over. Get out." He froze, words failing him. Then he tried a pitiful attempt to argue, to plead. I didn't listen. I had already made up my mind. He packed a small duffel bag silently, avoiding eye contact, and left through the door I had unlocked, my hands still trembling with adrenaline and rage. As the door clicked shut behind him, I realized I felt something I hadn't in months. Relief. Not happiness. Relief. The weight of deceit had been lifted, replaced by clarity. I sat on the couch, phone in hand, and stared at the space he had vacated. 3 years. Gone in a heartbeat. But the story wasn't over. I knew Richard well enough to suspect he wouldn't vanish quietly. He would try to find another way to manipulate someone else, to regain his fantasy lifestyle. And I wasn't about to let him drag anyone else down. I spent that night writing every detail in my journal. The apps, the lies, the patterns. Every little red flag I had ignored. Every excuse I had accepted. every sacrifice I had made. I realized how much I had tolerated, hoping love would excuse it. I vowed to myself silently with a grim satisfaction, "This is the end of your games, Richard, and anyone else who falls for them." The morning after I kicked Richard out, I expected silence. I thought I could wake up, drink my coffee, and pretend none of this had happened. But the truth was louder than any alarm. Richard was out there, scheming, trying to salvage the life he had built on lies. And I couldn't help but follow, cautiously, almost clinically, watching the chaos he had created. His first stop, unsurprisingly, was the women he had charmed through his dating apps. I overheard from mutual friends, small breadcrumbs of his desperate attempts. He had messaged one woman he'd been speaking to for weeks, someone he claimed he loved, someone he had planned a future with, begging for a place to stay for a few days. I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. This was the same man who had spun an elaborate fantasy of luxury and success, now groveling like a child at the doorsteps of strangers. Bryson, no, not a Bryson, Richard himself, got a polite, firm rejection. "I don't even remember you. Stop messaging me." He tried another, someone who had fawned over his apparent marketing career. Blocked. Another woman asked him flatly, "Are you serious? You lied to me about your job, your life, everything. Go away." I leaned back in my chair, the sunlight hitting my face, and I felt it, a mix of vindication and disbelief. How could someone so confident unravel so quickly? I had known him, loved him, trusted him, and yet the man he thought he was had no legs to stand on. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, he had sought women who could fund his dreams while lying about his reality. And now, when faced with the real world, no shortcuts, no lies to prop him up, he faltered spectacularly. I remembered the small details I had ignored, the way he clutched his phone, always nervous when someone called, how he'd smirk when I praised his career ambitions. Those smirks weren't charm, they were rehearsals for manipulation. And suddenly I saw everything clearly. Richard didn't know how to survive on his own. He had never learned, and it showed. A friend texted me later that afternoon, almost laughing. "Lucy, he tried hitting up Mackenzie, the one who always commented, 'Why ask Queen?' on his Instagram, asking to crash at her place. She shut him down. Then Jenna said she was out of town indefinitely. Reese's apartment is too small. Total rejection tour." I exhaled slowly. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, to see the man I once loved humbled, but that would have been a mistake. There was no love left, only a cautionary tale. I spent the evening reflecting on what I had endured. The anger I had felt that first night hadn't faded, but it was settling into something sharper, more precise, clarity. I understood now that love didn't excuse deception. I understood that boundaries weren't negotiable, and I understood, painfully, how much of my life I had unknowingly invested in someone else's fantasy. Meanwhile, Richard's descent continued. Word spread that he had no money, no credibility, no allies. The women who had been wooed by his charm now laughed behind closed doors. Even his father, who had quietly been covering his son's rent, began to confront the truth of Richard's failure. I imagined the conversations at home. "Richard, what have you done? 3 years of lies, and for what?" Part of me couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. Not cruelty, exactly, but justice. It was poetic, watching him struggle in the very ways he had tried to control others. And then came the first glimmer of worry. Not for him, for me. I realized that while he was spiraling, I needed to be careful. People like Richard often claw at others to regain control. I locked my doors a little tighter, changed passwords, and reminded myself, this was my life, reclaimed. That night, I wrote again in my journal, 3 years, 3 years of deceit, and yet I am still standing, I am still me, and I won't let anyone, not him, not anyone else, make me forget that. For the first time in months, I felt light. Not free, not yet, but the weight had lifted enough to take a breath. And while Richard floundered, scrambling and humiliated, I began to see the faint outline of what my life could be without him. Honest, intentional, unburdened. By the end of the week, Richard's attempts at salvage had completely failed. Every message was ignored or blocked. Every plea met with derision. He had nothing to stand on. And as I scrolled past the remnants of his digital footprint, the dating profiles I had screenshot weeks before, I realized something profound. The man I loved never existed. The fantasy had been beautiful, compelling, convincing, but it had been fake. And that realization, as painful as it was, became the seed of my liberation. I went to bed that night with a sense of quiet triumph. I hadn't sought revenge, hadn't orchestrated his humiliation. It had happened on its own, like karma in slow motion. And I slept, finally, without the weight of deception pressing on my chest. Tomorrow, I told myself, would be about closure, about understanding the full extent of his lies, about facing the reality of his family's involvement, and about ensuring, once and for all, that I would never be manipulated or betrayed like this again. Because one thing was certain, Richard Wilson had underestimated me, and that, more than anything, was his undoing. By the end of that week, I thought I had seen everything, but as I scrolled through a few forgotten emails and messages, a nagging thought struck me. How deep does this lie really go? Curiosity, tinged with dread, pushed me further. I began piecing together details I had ignored, the constant mentions of his dad helping out, casual references to rent, the excuses about bills. One evening, I finally picked up the phone and dialed. "Mr. Jones?" I asked, my voice steady but cautious. "Yes," a deep, weary voice answered. I think you should know something about your son," I said. And then I sent the screenshots. Every lie, every dating profile, every audacious attempt to live a life he didn't earn. There was a long silence. I could almost hear him breathing, absorbing it. "Is this real?" he finally asked, voice tight. "All of it?" I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I'm afraid so, and I think you need to know before he tries to manipulate anyone else." A pause, then, "Thank you for telling me. I'll handle this." That was all I needed to know. Richard had underestimated the consequences of his deceit, but his father wasn't someone who tolerated foolishness lightly. The next morning, I got a cryptic text from an unknown number. "Richard isn't coming home tonight. Handle your part." I realized, with a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction, that the endgame was already in motion. Richard, the man who had spent years living off deception and entitlement, would finally face accountability. Not from me, but from someone who mattered deeply to him, his father. I remembered, with bitter clarity, all the little moments I had excused over the years, the unexplained withdrawals, the business trips that never existed, the subtle arrogance masked as charm. All of it pointed to the same truth. He could not exist without manipulation, lies, and financial crutches. That evening, Richard returned, or rather, tried to. He rang the doorbell, hopeful, smiling that smug smile he had always worn when he thought he could charm his way out of trouble. "Lucy, can we talk?" he asked. I didn't open the door. Instead, I replied through the crack, "Your father has already talked to you, Richard. I don't need to. You've had every opportunity to be honest, and you failed. Get out." His face fell, his jaw tightening. "Please, just 5 minutes." I shook my head. "No, you're on your own now." I watched him walk away, shoulders slumped, dignity crumpled, and for the first time I felt no remorse, only clarity, only freedom. Over the next few days, I learned more from Mr. Jones. Richard had been lying about his job for years, living off part-time shoe store wages and manipulating both me and his father to sustain his fantasy lifestyle. He had asked his dad to cover rent, to fund bills, even to lend him money for weekends he claimed were business trips. I remember feeling a strange mix of anger and disbelief. How had I not seen it sooner? And yet I also felt a certain respect for the inevitability of justice. Richard's web of lies was unraveling, thread by thread. Meanwhile, I reflected on myself. I realized how much I had endured. The constant compromise, the patience, the belief that love would fix everything. That love, I now knew, wasn't broken. It had just been misapplied. One evening, as I sat on the balcony overlooking the city, I thought about Richard, his desperation, his arrogance, and his ultimate failure. He had gambled with honesty, integrity, and relationships, and lost, and I was free to rebuild, free to trust again, carefully, free to love myself first. In that quiet moment, I made a vow. No one would ever manipulate or deceive me like that again. I had been betrayed, yes, but I had also survived. And survival, I realized, was the first step toward real power. The first signs of Richard's downfall were subtle. Missed messages, unanswered calls, ignored pleas. But soon, his failures became spectacularly public. He tried again, desperately, reaching out to the women he had charmed online, promising that he was changing. that he just needed a temporary place, just a few days. No one believed him. One woman laughed outright at his audacity. Another blocked him mid-sentence. Even the women who had hyped him up on social media, the ones who once commented, "Yas, queen," vanished the moment he actually needed them. The irony was delicious. For years, he had targeted wealthy women, spinning elaborate tales about being a marketing executive, a globetrotter, a man worthy of admiration. Now, when his own fantasy collapsed, he discovered that charm and lies only went so far. I heard stories secondhand, bits and pieces of his humiliation, and I had to fight to suppress a smile. He arrived at one woman's apartment, only to be told he didn't even remember her name. He tried to explain, to charm, to plead, and left with nothing but embarrassment and bruised pride. But the most devastating blow came from his father. Mr. Jones had spent years quietly covering for him, paying rent, and supplying financial support. But even indulgence has limits. Richard had gambled away trust for far too long. Now, Mr. Jones confronted him. "Richard," his father said, voice low and steady, "I've covered for you, protected you, believed in you, but this, all of this, has consequences. You're on your own now." I imagined Richard's face in that moment. Disbelief, panic, the first real crack in his self-assured veneer. He had never been accountable for anything in his life, and suddenly the world demanded it of him. Meanwhile, I felt a strange mix of relief and empowerment. It wasn't satisfaction in cruelty, but in truth. Richard's lies had been exposed. The man I had loved never existed, and I could finally move forward. Social consequences followed swiftly. Friends who had once admired him for his charisma now whispered behind closed doors. Colleagues discovered the inconsistencies in his resume, the fictitious marketing executive claims that had floated for years. Humiliation was everywhere. Even his part-time job couldn't shield him. He walked into the shoe store expecting normalcy, only to find colleagues aware of his online antics. Some snickered behind counters, others outright confronted him about his lies. He had no defenses, no one to charm, no excuses that held weight. And me? I watched quietly. I didn't seek revenge, didn't orchestrate his downfall. It happened organically. I had removed myself from the equation, and yet the universe seemed intent on delivering justice. For my part, I focused on rebuilding. Each day without Richard was a reclamation of myself, my space, my time, my peace. I began dating myself again, laughing freely, reconnecting with friends, and exploring hobbies I had neglected. It was as if the weight of his deceit had lifted, leaving room for growth, clarity, and genuine happiness. Even when I caught wind of his further desperate attempts, trying to convince strangers to let him stay, spinning elaborate lies about his life and me, I felt nothing but a quiet certainty. I was untouchable by his schemes. I had learned the truth about him, and the truth was stronger than any fantasy he could conjure. By the end of the week, Richard had nothing. No allies, no financial support, no credibility. The world that had once seemed to revolve around him had moved on, and I, for the first time in years, felt free to breathe fully, to reclaim every piece of life he had tried to manipulate. That night, I sat on my balcony, the city lights sparkling below, and for the first time, I laughed, soft, private, unrestrained. The man I had loved, the illusions I had carried, the betrayal I had endured, all of it was behind me. I was standing, strong, unbroken, and more importantly, free. Weeks passed, and the echoes of Richard's deception slowly faded from my life. The apartment, once filled with his laughter, his mess, his lies, now felt like my sanctuary again. Every corner reminded me that I had reclaimed my space, my life, my power. Richard's downfall had continued in ways I only heard about secondhand. His father, exhausted and disillusioned, refused further bailouts. His part-time job terminated him after a string of unprofessional incidents, tardiness, excuses, and outright lies about his previous work experience. Even the few online connections he had tried to exploit evaporated. The women who once entertained his charm now mocked him publicly on social media. I won't lie. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing the man who had manipulated, lied, and depended on everyone else for his fantasy life had nothing left. Yet I didn't celebrate. I only observed. His collapse was a cautionary tale, a mirror, showing me what I had narrowly escaped. For me, life began anew. I reconnected with friends who had watched me suffer quietly, offering support and laughter. I enrolled in a photography workshop I had always postponed, rekindling passions I had set aside. The weight of betrayal had been heavy, but the clarity it brought was liberating. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Richard's father, Mr. Jones. "Lucy, thank you for everything, for honesty, for standing your ground. I see now how serious his deception was. You did the right thing." I smiled, typing back, "Thank you. I only did what I had to do for myself." And it was true. I hadn't acted out of revenge or malice. I had acted to protect myself, and in doing so, I had exposed the truth. The man I loved, or thought I loved, no longer had power over me. A few days later, I ran into Richard, briefly, at a coffee shop. He looked smaller somehow, humbled, stripped of the bravado that had once been so convincing. He approached cautiously. "Lucy, can we talk?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "There's nothing to say, Richard. You've had every chance. You chose your lies. I chose my life." He looked down, shame replacing the arrogance I had once endured. He mumbled something I didn't catch, and then he walked away, leaving me to the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. For the first time in years, I felt whole. My heart was no longer weighed down by deception or manipulation. I had survived betrayal, exposed the truth, and emerged stronger. Weeks turned into months, and I continued to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. I nurtured friendships, focused on my career, and, most importantly, trusted myself again. Richard faded from my life completely, a ghost of the past. He was a lesson, not a wound. And in that lesson, I discovered something profound. Power isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling your own life, your choices, and your boundaries. One evening, as the city lights glittered beneath my balcony, I realized how far I had come. The woman who had once been naive, trusting, and vulnerable was gone. In her place stood Lucy Collins, resilient, aware, and fiercely independent. And as I sipped my wine, a soft smile curved my lips. Life, with all its twists, betrayals, and unexpected lessons, had led me here, to freedom, clarity, and a peace I had never known. The door to my past was closed. The future, bright, unencumbered, and entirely mine, awaited.